Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of CRO Wisdom. I'm delighted today to have Senior Vice President of and Head of Technology and Operations Risk and the CISO at CIT, Paul Milkman. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Paul, one of the questions I always start with, because we find that risk leaders often come from very, very different backgrounds. So, how did your career in the risk management space begin?
Really by accident and in two phases at two very different times. So in the late 90s, I worked for, at the time, a very large, powerful company called Xerox. It is less so today than it was then. But I was offered a job. I had a role in technology and was offered a role in information security for the first time, which was the first sort of risk-related thing I had done. That led to a career including consulting and in security and privacy for IBM. I led a consulting unit for the financial sector, and then eventually got hired by a financial sector firm. But that was really all cyber-related, with business continuity and privacy elements starting to creep in. The risk management portion came when we had a head of operational risk, and this was at Fannie Mae, who basically, just in learning what she knew, I realized I knew nothing about front end risk assessment or business risk. And I think she probably realized that there was quite a bit I could teach her about controls and what actually went on in the front lines and down at the bits and bytes level or the operational level. And so between the two of us, I think we opened up sort of a knowledge base that allowed me to become a risk manager while doing some of these frontline roles. And it was a pretty big changeover in the early 2000s. And so I've sort of considered myself a risk guy ever since, as opposed to, just a cyber guy or something else.
Right. Interesting journey. So, Paul, when you look at your role today, how would you kind of talk about your key priorities?
Yeah, I think in my world, if you think of my role, I've worked at larger places and smaller places, and currently at a mid-sized place. And so at a mid-sized place, your scope is a little broader. And so it's a large portion of what we would call non-financial risk. So I'm interested in, sort of all the processes that lead to control of some of the non-financial risks. And the big ones, obviously, right now, you could rip right out of the headlines, right? Cyber for sure is a big deal. Resiliency in the sense of ransomware and cyber going together are certainly a big deal for a lot of firms. Less a problem in the larger banks and the mid-sized banks, but definitely a problem. And then really the whole nature of our third party and hybrid relationships with everybody. So at this point, any larger firm is so dependent on other either technology partners, operational partners, processors, customers. Everybody's manipulating data and transactions and money. And there are very, very different levels of maturity to various control programs. And so probably the single biggest priority right now is getting arms around all of the different third parties and trying to continually maintain good control relationships with them.
So, Paul, as you just said, very clearly the headlines are about cyber and ransomware. But as we look at our third parties, particularly with COVID, we recognize that a lot of the risks that initially started were not really cyber. So how do you think about risk domains beyond cyber?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly it's tricky because, we talk about third party and vendor risks. Honestly, there's the vendor risks and third party risks are exactly the same as the risks that you have internally. And they really are the same. They're just geographically different because they're not in your shop. The big ones, I think, really still are relating to data handling. Now we're not talking about cyber or hacking. We're just talking about people doing the right things with data within the law, the rapidly changing laws. I think the regulatory environment is constantly shifting. It's not shifting quickly, but when you change presidential administration, the expectation and the foci of the different regulators changes a little bit. I think the one that's probably on the horizon as kind of the next big thing again is going to be reputational.
Yeah.
There's so much capital flowing around, and confidence in institutions, is not completely based on all of the objective baseline financials and other things that we used to see. So some of the non-financial risks around reputation, around proximity to bad things, proximity to people who sour in the marketplace. I think that's one of the up and coming ones that we really need to pay attention to for sure.
Yeah, Paul, in fact, just this last week, we saw House pass a disclosure requirement for public companies around their ESG practices, as an example.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and that is it's a growing area of concern. I think certainly for banks, risk management, it's like we add a new topic, a new risk, and a new part of our taxonomy every year, or old ones that we'd sort of forgotten about seem to pop up again. Um, but the list never gets shorter.
Yeah.
Sort of the sheer handling of risk data and risk infrastructure is definitely challenging.
Right. So, Paul, very true. The list doesn't get shorter. And the other thing is this whole requirement of no longer enough to do an assessment on onboarding or once a year. Now I need to know their status continuously. Talk to us about kind of how you're thinking about this whole move to continuous monitoring.
Yeah, it's an imperfect situation. Certainly for a heightened standards bank, it's a bit problematic. And the reality is, no one today has the same level of maturity around infrastructure, information sharing, public-private partnership, private-private partnership, and the overall program investment as, say, the large banks do. Right? They've just been managing
Yeah.
both financial and non-financial risks for decades, and the maturity and the spend absolutely shows. But in order to really serve our customers, and they could be retail customers or consumers, or traders, or anybody else, or um, commercial lending or other types of businesses, to really serve people, you've got to take advantage of some of the innovation that the fintechs are bringing, and that some commoditized processes are bringing, and cloud is bringing. And so you're now instantly dealing with people who aren't banks, and assessing them, I think, to your point, isn't particularly hard. You can do due diligence, and ask them how they're handling a particular control area or managing a particular risk. And what we're finding is the level of sophistication of our own oversight programs has had to increase dramatically. Um, if you talk to a firm that's at the lowest end of the maturity scale, they may be very immature and not have done business with a large company before. You're really translating the language of risk for them into things they understand. And so, in order to really operate with them, interoperate with them, you're almost teaching them the things that you're going to monitor, and you'll get as many of them into the contracts as you can, but you're always going to have to limit your risk, limit your overall risk profile and posture with those types of vendors, because they aren't going to get it anytime soon. They are going to mature, but they're not going to mature quickly. And then you have sort of middle level firms and large firms, and you have different degrees to which you can say, um, map your controls to our controls across a broad operational spectrum or operational risk spectrum. And we're just going to accept your reporting as is. And we don't really want to see detail that provides us liability, but we want to see your summaries, and we can map those to our own dashboards. And then you get some that are sort of in between, where you're mapping your framework to their framework. They're pretty different, and you're going to get the most of what you can. The staffs that are required now just to monitor those interactions with those three different sizes of vendors or three different maturities of vendors is substantial. And so where you might have had, a few people signed to establish a vendor management framework, and you might have trusted your individual relationship managers with each of those vendors before, now you actually have to have both second line and first line people for those in the line of defense models who actually are positioned to do the detail work. And it's not okay in the eyes of the regulators to just assume because it isn't yours, it's somebody else's liability. It's clear now that our liability lies, all the way from bottom to top in a transaction.
Right. So Paul, with all these increasing needs and requirements, there have been some really amazing AI automation tools in the market, particularly around risk management. Can you talk kind of from your perspective of what you're excited about, or what do you actually also at the same time worry about when you think about those?
It's going to go counter to the question. I've found AI to be, for the last 15 years, really the biggest disappointment in both technology and risk management. I think basic analytics, basic, rule design, machine learning to accelerate the ability to analyze data. I believe all those things are incredibly powerful, but they've really been powerful since the 70s. Like that isn't really new. The idea that a model can give you the characteristics in an actionable way that you want, I think is trickier. One of the largest banks in the U.S. spent a lot of money on to the tune of $200 million a year, the most powerful AI available. They had the most data elements available that anybody has ever tried to use in operational risk. They put 150 people in a room and they made it run for a couple of years. And within a couple of years, it had been taken over by marketing, because marketing was able to use suggestive data out of the consumer and transactional data that the cyber people were never able to really get an advantage from. And so I think it's been disappointing outside of marketing in general. I think in risk management, the level of detail required to run a good risk management program requires a really firm connection between the risks and the size and type of those risks that exist for any given asset or business, and the very specific controls that can actually impact your residual position. I think most people get that wrong. If you have that fundamental thing wrong, AI is not going to help you. If you analyze the threat level against one very specific thing that may or may not be important to you. So I tend to think that AI still has a way to go before we see some broad implications from it. And maybe I'm just an old fuddy-duddy, but I'm pretty technical, and I've tried, and I understand data management pretty well, and I've attempted to do some pretty sophisticated things with it, but I so far I've been pretty disappointed.
Right. At the same time, I think, when we think about other areas of automation, like you said, Paul, like bots and machine learning, they really helped companies get access to better data, analyze better data. But
Yep.
I understand what you're talking about in terms of predictive analytics, kind of leveraging AI for some of that. The promise has not been fully lived up to, for sure.
Sure.
Yeah. So Paul, because of all this complexity, all these new requirements, all these challenges, let's turn to kind of personal development. So Bloomberg Magazine recently called risk manager a hot job. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it depends which risk management job it is and what industry you're in. I think it's certainly chief risk officer in particular, I think, and more senior level sort of risk managers with a subject matter expertise. And I would extend this over into compliance. Many more industries are blooming to a point where they actually now understand the importance of better risk management. You'd see it in pockets. If you're building aircraft engines at General Electric years ago, they had really interesting and very capable risk management practices. But a lot of the other parts of the company wouldn't have. Obviously, banking is banking, and there aren't that many new giant banks, right? There's been a lot of consolidation. So the number of people who really understand it broadly for a given industry in banking isn't so bad, but the number of people who would understand how to do the same types of work for a utility or a mid-sized manufacturer or even in healthcare, there's a massive shortage of people who understand broadly what basic risk frameworks look like and how you assess and decide where to spend your next dollar in terms of reducing your residual risk and your risk to your customers and partners. And so I think it's absolutely a hot job, but like the housing market in many places, in many industries, there's a real supply shortage. So it won't appear as
Yeah.
a hot job because you can't even hire, some of the people that you want. But I'm sure it will mature and, across industries in general, not just in banking. It'll be interesting.
Yeah, definitely the demand for those roles is really high. So, Paul, what resources do you rely on to make yourself a better risk leader?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. You could interpret what you mean by resources a number of different ways. I think the anchor that everyone as a risk professional needs to have is the thing that I mentioned before, which is that having a methodology around how you think about relating some of those key definitional areas. Like, you really need a good definition for inherent risk, and you need a model to size it. You need a mental model to be able to compare different types of risk. You need to be able to say that type of privacy risk is roughly the same as that size of financial reporting accuracy risk or that size of resiliency risk. You need to be able to talk in practical terms to board members, regulators, senior leaders, and the ability to articulate risk both in terms of inherent and residual position, as well as the relationship between controls to those residual positions. In whatever facet of risk you're working, you've got to be able to do it. You've got to be able to do it at a level of elevator speak. You have to be able to speak simply about boom, boom, boom. These are our risks. These are how we size them. Here's the controls we have lined up against them. And our final position is moderate. Or our final position is however you do it. And if you don't get the linguistics right, and I was an English major in college, and so I had kind of a weird background to be doing what I'm doing, but I've always really focused on how do you make something demonstrable or translatable or relatable to your audience. And your audience could be a software developer, it could be somebody doing a process in an operational center, could be a regulator, it could be a board member, it could be an investor, it could be anybody. So how do you make sure you have the risk language that will work for all of them, and it still represents something objective?
Paul, that's really helpful because it actually answered what was going to be my last question, which is, what risk do you have for future risk leaders? And I think you articulated some of them extremely well. Is there anything else you would say to somebody who's wanting to make a career in risk?
It really is. It really is that. It's probably, don't assume that risk management is as mature in the non-financial areas as it is in, say, credit. And so don't take anybody's word, mine included, as verbatim the only way to do it. Definitely keep an open mind and make it make sense to you. If you can't explain your basic risk management processes and risk management reporting to somebody in an elevator in 27 seconds, they probably don't make sense. And you've really got to work to make it practical and make it make sense. I think it's the single most important thing, as opposed to getting lost in the numbers and in the jargon that we sometimes use. That would probably be my best advice for a future risk leader.
Paul, thank you so much for making time to not just share your experience, but also share your knowledge with the audience. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciated being here.